you guys all for coming. This is the monthly seminar series that I'm hosting here at the University of Minnesota Psychedelic Neuroscience. So this is sort of a pilot content for a course I'm developing here that I hope to eventually teach officially at the university to educate students about psychedelic neuroscience, as it is kind of a hot topic right now, both in mental health as well as the neurosciences. So this is, I think, like the 5th version that we've had. And so for this month's psychedelic neuroscience, we're going to have the neurobiology of microdosing presented by Christopher Gunlock. So he's one of the core members and one of our board members or board of directors for the Psychedelic Society here in Minnesota. And he runs our Psychedelic Science Club and does a whole lot of great stuff for the Psychedelic Society. And so he'll be presenting to you today about all things microdosing. Join me in welcoming Christopher Gunlock.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jessica. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is an outlet that I have a lot of respect for. Being on the U of M campus is kind of a neat opportunity to talk about this kind of stuff because, it's important, but, we don't see it as often in the mainstream. Just want to express gratitude for that. And I'll start just talking a little bit about my background, just let you know where I'm coming from. My journey kind of began once I graduated high school, tried mushrooms. It was easily the most interesting thing I had ever done. Instantly started kind of a long time fascination with it. And so since then kind of been experimenting, just a long journey of like being intrigued and confused and just generally just interested. Over time, though, I found my way into meditation. And the reason I put this on here is it was actually a turning point in my psychedelic perspective because meditation for me, it validated the psychedelic state. It was the first time I realized that a similar states of consciousness were capable without drugs. And so for the first time, I really kind of saw the psychedelic state as not just this like drug-induced fantasy world, but as something that was actually core to some kind of innate human mechanism. Because if you go deep enough on the meditation, you can get real up there, And that was at the Maharishi University. I eventually got my bachelor's in mathematics, became a math tutor, basically was doing that for a long time. Eventually I made my way into integrative medicine where I got my graduate degree. And that's kind of been my direction since. And it's been really nice integrating that with psychedelics. And that was kind of the time when I first started seeing, the studies start to come out. It started to hit the mainstream around that time. And so my interest in psychedelics kind of like renewed. And I was like, wait a minute, this isn't just like this secret world that I, have on my own, but, there's like legit scientists like looking at this stuff. And so I started writing some papers, I started talking to my professors about it, and I found that if you come from like an evidence-based perspective, people are actually really willing to listen. Because this stuff has been in the dark, like literally for decades. Ever since 1970, psychedelics have been outlawed, not just on the streets, but in academic institutions as well. It's very difficult to get money to do psychedelic research. Is very difficult to get the DEA approval, FDA approval. So luckily things are rapidly changing though. In these last few years, around the time I started really getting into the Psychedelic Society, things have been picking up real nicely, and it's been real fun. Like we were talking about. Welcome, thanks for coming. It's been awesome being involved in the Psychedelic Society. I've learned so much from other people. It's been really inspiring to see the kinds of stories people coming from, like people making massive improvements with their mental health, people kind of with a renewed sense of, welcome, thanks for coming all. Oh, we got a big group coming in. No problem, have a seat. Brian, what's up, man? I made some good friends. It's Psychedelic Society I really owe a lot to. But that led also into some other ventures. My business that I apply the integrated medicine, health consulting, health coaching is the Open Mind Health Club. And that's kind of evolved more into a service of psychedelic integration. So that's where I talk to people about, experiences they may have had and see what we can do to integrate those experiences into a healthier lifestyle, addressing chronic health concerns. And that's really kind of the crux of health consulting, health coaching is the lifestyle changes, right? Like you may become acutely aware of what your problem is and what's causing the problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can change it. Maybe you're stuck in some kind of situation or stuck in a mindset or a habit that you can't get out of, and it just turns out psychedelics are a real potent way of changing your perspective, as we'll get into in a little bit here. But also, if I don't cover this, my buddy Adam will be ultra upset. Psychedelic Renaissance podcast. We just launched this last week. We're about to put out episode 2. So this is kind of a passion project we've been working on. We're really happy with how it turned out. It's on all the platforms: iTunes, Spotify. So feel free to check that out. We're also on the social medias. So. Let's get into the microdosing. So I'm going to go over as much evidence as I have been able to muster, going from the controlled experiments, which are considered to be more so the kind of the standard for what can be considered medicine. And unfortunately, microdosing is this really weird phenomena where there's not a whole lot of controlled experiments on it, but there's a whole bunch of people that are the legality aspect of it makes it a really interesting topic to look into. We'll also look at the survey studies, which are not considered to be as good of evidence, but nonetheless, they do provide a perspective that the controlled experiments can't always get at. We'll also look at the microdosing spokespeople. Since microdosing has kind of blown up in popular culture lately, there's been some key figures, celebrities, if you would, that are very open about microdosing and have even kind of taken on an entrepreneurial perspective on it as well. And so we'll cover their perspectives. I think that's as anecdotal as it is, I think it is important to look at what these kind of key figures are saying about microdosing psychedelics. And then, of course, we'll get into the neurobiology, the neuroscience. There's again, not a whole lot on microdosing specifically, but in the last 5-10 years, there has been some big advancements in psychedelic science in general. And so we'll see if any of that can apply to microdosing in general. And then if we have time, there's a part of my talk I like to bring in other techniques or methods of reaching similar states of consciousness or doing things that are similar neurobiologically to psychedelics, and kind of make an argument for why microdosing might kind of serve similar purposes. So let us get into it. So starting with the basics, this talk isn't going to be so much about the how-tos of microdosing, partly because we just don't really know. Like, frankly, there's no one right way of doing microdosing as far as people are concerned. It's really the Wild West as far as microdosing goes right now. But that being said, there are some kind of basics that we can say. Dosages is kind of the key thing about microdosing, right? It's not a macrodose, it's a microdose. And so dosages are more in the threshold range, threshold being like the level of dosage that where you would actually notice you're on a psychoactive substance. And microdosing is around threshold or below. So I just pulled these off of Arrowwood, and as far as actually the studies go, they're using pretty similar dosages. So popular understanding of psychedelic dosing is actually pretty equivalent to the academic understanding of it too. So it's kind of nice to see that. But keep in mind, these are ballpark ranges, very, very much ballpark, especially, with both LSD and mushrooms, because LSD being an illegal street drug, you're not getting a reliable dose every time. You don't even know exactly how many micrograms are in like one tab of acid. And so the best that most people can do is just cut it up into little pieces and hope that 1/10 of a tab is a microdose. But even then, who knows? Mushrooms, even though it's like an organic substance, it's not much easier either, because depending on what species of mushrooms you have, how they were grown, how they were dried, how they were powdered, or whatever form they're in, the potency can vary wildly. So just keep that in mind. And then some other kind of points that come from the anecdotal reports are a lot of people take off days in their microdosing. In other words, they don't take their microdoses every day, particularly for the avoidance of tolerance building. And then anecdotally, again, LSD usually is reported to be more stimulating, mushrooms more calming, but I mean, that's variable to the individual. But one thing that definitely is different about LSD versus mushrooms is the duration of their effects. LSD lasts for 12, 14, 16 hours, mushrooms about half that. So people taking that into account, they may use one for one purpose and one for another. So other than that, like LSD and mushrooms are the most common. However, there have been some reports of people using DMT, ibogaine, ayahuasca for microdosing even, which would be kind of weird. But I mean, these are all classical psychedelics. Technically, you could microdose anything. Yeah, so let's get on into the experiments. So again, controlled experiments. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, questions, totally good. Just throw a hand up. We're one here and one here, so we'll go. Yeah. What's up, Brandon?
One comment on the LSD. I heard you say like cut it into 1/10. If anyone's looking to experiment with LSD microdosing, just Google volumetric dosing.
Ah.
You get much more accurate results.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. So comments and questions, very welcome. Breaking this up into discussions will be really fun. So let's go ahead and do that. What's up?
I've heard that with mushrooms, when the mushroom is a certain size, kind of like the size of a 22 caliber bullet, it has all the psilocybin it's going to have in its entire life. So as it gets bigger, it just gets less concentrated. Is
Okay.
that true?
I mean, I've heard like once the veil breaks, that's the point where it stops making it or something like that. Brian, you have some insights on that?
Yes, there's like a little abort if you get that they're really strong, but they do still increase the psilocybin, so it doesn't just get watered down, but it definitely like there's like a curve where it's going to produce a lot rapidly, and then it's going to keep producing it a little bit.
You could repeat the comment for questions so you can hear it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll try to remember to do that. Yeah. The question was, does the mushroom stop creating psilocybin after a certain point? So yeah, cool. Mushrooms, that in itself is a wonderfully fascinating area of study. I hope at some point somebody could be up here just as a mycologist or something like that. Would be awesome. But yeah, so controlled experiments. Again, this is kind of the gold standard for proving that a medicine is good for people or has some kind of application. And this is because you're doing direct observation, right? You're putting people in a controlled situation. You're giving them controlled dosages in a controlled environment, and ideally you'll have a placebo group. So you're comparing the effects of a drug to people thinking that they're just on a drug, and ideally you'll even blind it so people don't know they're getting the placebo, and maybe even randomize who's getting the placebo, who's not. So these allow for a better kind of standard of evidence, but again, unfortunately, microdosing is really kind of early in these phases of experimentation. Nonetheless, there is a little bit out there. This one is kind of cool. This one came from the Netherlands. There's actually a psychedelic society there. As you can imagine, they have some fun, right? Because truffles are legal to buy there and use recreationally. And those are psilocybin-containing mushrooms, essentially, just grown in a different way. So what we're looking at here is a group of 38 people. They were members of the Psychedelic Society. They were in a fairly controlled situation. There was no placebo group. They were taking a range of dosages, so not a whole lot of control going on there. But what was interesting about this is they gave them some cognitive tests. And there's an example of one of them here. This is testing, let's see if I remember, This is convergent thinking. So convergent thinking is where you have like a set of ideas and you want to find what's common among all of them, or what's the common solution, or something like that. And so it's very much like focusing down in on one idea based on a bunch of other things that may have something in common. Divergent thinking would be the opposite of that. Divergent is trying to think of as many ideas as you can, or as many solutions as you can to like one problem. And both of these are considered to be involved in the creative process, and so ideally you would have both. And and they also did some fluid intelligence tests. That's like your basic analytic capabilities, and they did find that wasn't terribly affected, which is probably a good thing, right? You know, when you're tripping, it's a little hard to maybe focus on stuff, and so a microdose ideally would not really kind of disrupt your abilities to do normal things. And they did note in the study that there has been other studies on macrodoses on convergent and divergent thinking. And it is understood that when you get up in the higher doses of psychedelics, it's your divergent thinking that increases, but at the expense of convergent thinking. So if anyone here has had a psychedelic experience, you may know it's a little tough to focus in on one thing at a time, a little tough to do kind of like normal, logical, kind of systematic, linear thinking. But divergent thinking is definitely like ramped way up. You know, you're connecting ideas that maybe you wouldn't have thought of in a more sober state. So what did they find? Interestingly, they found both convergent and divergent thinking to increase. Which again is kind of ideal. I mean, that's kind of what you want to see. You know, that gives you a little bit more of that ability to do normal things, right? But with a little bit of an edge, a creative edge on it. What's up, guys? Oh, that's my mom. Hey, Mom. So it's kind of an interesting study. Not a terribly well-controlled study, though, so take it with a grain of salt. This next one was pretty well controlled. Group of 48 taking LSD at 5, 10, and 20 micrograms, so definitely within that below threshold range. 5 definitely being on the low end, 20 being kind of average. So this was randomized and placebo-controlled and double-blinded, so pretty well-controlled study. They did take out people with major health issues, so we're not really looking at how well does microdosing apply to illnesses, but what they did look at is people's perception of time. And so what they did was they showed people on a screen an image for just a few seconds. And they had a button where they had to press the button for what they thought was the same amount of time that the image was showing on the screen. And what they found was that, whoops, sorry, I can go back one. Statistically, there was significantly overestimations of these durations of time among the LSD group. And that's kind of what you see with, oh, sorry, if my mouse is, if I forget about that, remind me. I don't want to cover up stuff. But the blue dots, these are your LSD subjects, and so the graph is showing their estimations for each of the time durations. And so the dots were a little bit higher for the LSD group, meaning there was overestimations there. And then the graph on the, what is that, the left for you guys, is showing the different dosages, so the 5, 10, and 20 micrograms. The only kind of interesting thing to pull out of this one is overestimated more often than the 20, which seems really strange to me. It could just be experimental error, because, you know, again, this is 48 people. But I don't know. I mean, any ideas out here of why? Like, why would it be an overestimation, not an underestimation?
They told how much they were taking?
This was double-blinded, so they were not. They were not told.
They
Yeah.
didn't know how much they were.
They had no idea. Right. Yep. Yeah, but like, does it make sense, like intuitively, to overestimate time while you're on psychedelics?
Yeah.
Like, why do you think that would be?
It could be like, so think about how the brain conceives time, right? So if it's sensory snapshots, it could be I had 100 sensory snapshots in the past 100 sensory snapshots equal to so much time.
Uh-huh.
Like a baby is probably learning how to associate how many sensory snapshots to what time.
So this is like things that you're processing in your
Yeah,
mind.
like how do I know 5 minutes have elapsed? Is how many sensory snapshots I've seen in time, and generally I have an estimate of how much 5 minutes feels like in terms of sensory snapshots.
Yeah,
And so
but
now if
then
you're highly sensitized when you're on a psychedelic, you are seeing more sensory snapshots.
Yeah.
So your brain thinks more time has elapsed.
more time. Yeah, I like that explanation. In the back, Aaron, what's up?
Could it be because of the amount of stimulus? Like there's so much stimulus going on that,
Yeah.
that it's a shorter time duration. There's just so much going on that in a normal waking state, for like normal base level conscious, it's easy to like kind of filter that and address all that. But when there's so much stimulus, I just think that.
But then why would the inverse be true at a higher dose, actually?
Yeah, that part didn't make entirely intuitive sense. I mean, maybe it was a mistake or something. But yeah, over here and then Adam.
Maybe the dose you take determines how fast it comes on, and if they were given this test, you know, at X amount of time after they were administered the dose, the effects might be different for, you know, the more you take, the faster it comes on or something like that?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, metabolism is different for each person too. Again, experimental error is definitely a possibility here. Adam, did you have some?
But were the differences between time of the doses of LSD significant, or was it just significant that LSD in general compared to the control?
Well, that was the funny thing about the 5, 10, and 20 micrograms. The 10 micrograms seemed to overestimate more than the 20 and the 5. Again, the explanation, your guess is as good as mine. But that wasn't the only thing they kind of found interesting about this. They had a placebo group, and they would ask them throughout the test, how are you feeling? Basically, do you feel like you're on drugs? You know, are you getting any perceptual distortions, unusual thoughts? Not in every case, but for the most part, there's a definite significance of the people who were taking the LSD seem to answer these questions more in terms of I'm on something right now, which would indicate the placebo effect isn't the only thing going on here, and that in itself is interesting because a lot of people they'll attribute, especially something like microdoses, to placebo effect. You just think you feel better, you just think you're more creative, and whether or not you are, that would invalidate the microdosing in general. But this is pretty good evidence that people are definitely feeling something when they are in fact on something. So yeah, let's check out another study here. This one, 20 people, LSD, again, similar dosages. This one was controlled in terms of giving them the microdoses at a certain time, and they would ask some questions throughout. And it was double-blinded and placebo-controlled as well. And again, they're screening out psychiatric disorders, so we're not looking at how well microdoses apply to illnesses, but more in terms of what's their mood, response to emotional stimuli, how's your memory, blood pressure, body temperature, heart rate. So what do they find? Mood seemed to be improved in general. And we'll look at in a second exactly what parameters were improving. And it was interesting, the responses to emotional stimuli seemed to be dulled somewhat. Working memory tests didn't seem to change. Blood pressure was slightly increased, and that's generally what we see for psychedelics in general. There is a slight increase in blood pressure and heart rate, although in this case they didn't find much difference in heart rate, maybe because it was a microdose and not a macrodose. But yeah, so let's take a look at what they were asking them. So in terms of how they were feeling, this one had some interesting language, very kind of colorful descriptions here. Experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness. If you look at the bars, the lighter colored bars are the higher doses, the dark colored bars, the placebo. And so it's pretty clear that the higher the dose, the more people were experiencing these kinds of things. And again, this is double-blinded, so they did not know whether or not they had the placebo. So there is some significance there. And then some other questions regarding like ego dissolution, disembodiment from the ego, impaired control and cognition. That one sounds like weird to me. I'm not sure how I would answer that if they were asking me, but apparently when you're on LSD, there is some kind of impaired control and cognition. Anxiety, though, that's an interesting one, right? Because that's, you know, not something you necessarily want to have, and it's actually something some people claim microdosing helps with. But as we'll see, there are some people that react with anxiety in these studies, so we'll see a little bit more of that. And then the visionary restructuralization. Yeah, what's up?
Were these subjects, you said there was a week between each treatment condition?
Yeah.
Did these subjects go through all 4 conditions?
Sorry, say that last bit.
Did each of the subjects in the study go through all 4 conditions? So everyone had to see what...
Oh, a crossover study? By the way, the question was, did each of the subjects do all 4 conditions? In other words, the doses and the placebo. I don't think it was a crossover. So no, I don't think so. I think. Well, actually, I mean, it was multiple weeks. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question 100%. It's possible. But so then some other questions were a little bit less correlated. Complex imagery, elementary imagery, audiovisual, synesthesia. You know, these kinds of things you would expect more on a macro dose. And so it's kind of not surprising then that the scores were lower, except for maybe the highest microgram dose. I think it was like 26 micrograms. That's still definitely around threshold, so I don't know if you would get stuff. What's up, Adam?
I'm sorry, they were in a lab or they took their at home?
Yeah. This was a direct observation in some kind of controlled setting. Yeah.
What were they up to?
Oh, good question. You know, it's weird when I'm reading these studies. They're very, very thorough about everything, like but that. Like, you know, it's like what the heck they're doing in the room. Like, are they just chilling, drawing? Like, I don't know. Honestly, I wish they would be more descriptive about that. Yeah. They did some other stuff. Again, testing the placebo effect. Do you feel like you're on a drug? Do you feel high? You know, do you like this drug? And this one's a little harder to see, but oh, my mouse disappears. Okay, that's good. So the solid lines are the placebo, and if you look closely, the solid lines do tend to be lower than all of the other ones, and that would again indicate that people who were on the LSD did seem to feel like they were on something. And they even rated the rates of guessing whether or not they were on the placebo. And if you look at as the dose increases, the rate of guessing improved. So in other words, the higher the dose, the more sure of the fact that they were on the placebo or not. Yeah.
Seems like they dislike it.
Yeah, some people didn't like it. Yeah.
Because they like it. I don't know if they're different people.
Oh, like it's the same. Yeah, the numbers.
Same scale, obviously, it's like 20 versus 40. But...
Yeah, there's, you know, what does that mean, right? Did they ask him the questions like consecutively, and then they answered yes for both of them?
I wonder if it's just a different group of people.
That could be it too. I would hope so. That would be a.
It's the same. Does each person get the same? Like, do they all get the different doses?
If it's a crossover, I don't remember it being a crossover. I could be wrong there. It's a good question.
It's also important to ask, like, how many of these subjects have done psychedelics before? The group is like, you know, from this society. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the studies I included here controlled for that kind of expectation of or previous experiences. So we'll see a little bit of evidence as far as whether or not that was this study. I don't remember reading anything about that though. Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering is, so wouldn't different people have different like levels of responsiveness? Like at a certain level, one person might respond, whereas another person wouldn't.
I would be like, how that would screw up the results. Yeah, I would assume so. I mean, with any drug, I think that's definitely a variable, right? Yeah. And controlling for that, I don't know, that'd be kind of tough. I think that's where your sample size is kind of the only thing you can do. Just get as many people as you can and many different kinds of people. But that's also one of the limitations of science, you know, like the more controlled your study is, the less representative it's going to be of the population at large, because we are all unique. And So that's kind of where I like to speak more towards the survey studies and the anecdotal reports, because that can get to some of the more unique cases or some of the broader kind of meta understandings of psychedelics. Jessica, did you have some?
Oh, just so each person got every dose. They randomized the order, so they were blinded to the dose, the intensity of the dose, and everyone had to have at least one.
Oh, did you find my study on the internet?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Sorry, say again?
It's a within subjects, meaning every person got every single dose, but then they randomized the order that they got each dose, so they didn't know whether they were getting zero or a higher dose or a lower dose. So they didn't know what to expect.
There was some crossover then?
There was, yeah.
Okay.
So it's within subjects crossover design.
Okay.
Meaning everyone gets every condition, and then they don't know which condition they're getting for each session.
Nice.
And then everyone had to have done psychedelics at least once, so they had some experience.
Nice. Yeah, so cool. That answers a little bit. So somewhat experienced subjects, and there was crossover, so some people got both placebo and there was one more thing. The study looked at the response to emotional stimuli. So they were showing them images of, like happy things, sad things, whatever. And interestingly, there was some negative correlation. And in other words, the higher doses seemed to respond less positive to positive imagery, and ever so slightly more negative to negative imagery. So they were just in a bad mood or something. I don't know. Any guess as far as to why that might be, like being less responsive to positive imagery when you're on the LSD?
Personality type. There's the 5-factor personality domain. Some people are more neurotic. Some people are more open.
Yeah.
Respond differently to psychedelics.
Yeah, and depending on how they chose the subjects, their volunteer bias might be there.
Maybe the more they took, the more the setting feels like being under scrutinized.
Ooh, that. Yeah.
Like the more you took, the more you're feel vulnerable to that.
Vulnerable, sure. Yeah.
Piggybacking off on that, 26 micrograms based on my assessment is way more than a microdose.
Mm-hmm.
It's through threshold that can be uncomfortable in a social setting.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised by it.
Sensitivity, yeah. Neuroticism, yeah. Being in that state, having people kind of stare at you and ask you questions constantly. Yeah.
What was this for mushrooms? The same response for mushrooms?
Oh, this study was just LSD, so yeah, I couldn't say. We'll go into some other ones that did study mushrooms though. So cool, yeah. So let's keep going in the survey studies here. So again, survey studies not considered to be as good of evidence, but on the other hand, they do have the advantage of drawing from larger populations, and so you can get a bigger spread of opinions. But they are opinions. Typically, also people are self-reporting. They're taking the microdoses on their own in whatever conditions they're doing it, and whatever doses or whatever kinds of substances they're using. So it's subjective data, not as like objectively verifiable, but still interesting to look at. And one of the famous ones that I think kind of sparked this like psychedelic microdosing renaissance was James Fadiman's study. It was published in 2016, but he did conduct a study several years earlier. And so they questioned about 400 people. They're drawing from internet forums, and he found some interesting. There's a kind of a second layer of subjectivity to this too, because Fadiman is. From my understanding, he's not like a terribly rigorous researcher. He speaks very highly about microdosing, and the data. Sophia Korb was more of a statistical scientist, and so there was some validation as far as the statistical significance, but. They did note a lot of positive changes in mood. Some people reporting that it helped them with their depression. And there was some kind of interesting cases. One person claimed that their stuttering was cured from a microdose. One person claimed that their chronic menstrual pain was cured. They did also note that there wasn't a whole lot of reports of people feeling like the microdosing was doing them lasting harm. There was some reports of acute discomfort, one of them definitely being the anxiety case, which we'll see a little bit more evidence for that later too. But then also, this is of kind of, again, his opinion that people were not reporting a whole lot of complications with their prescriptions. He did note lithium might be an exception to that, though. So, yeah, because a lot of people, taking a prescription for something that they maybe want microdosing to help out a little bit more with is probably a fairly common phenomenon. So another study, this one a little bit more controlled. So it was still self-reported, and below in the chart you'll see the spread of substances people were using. LSD and psilocybin by far the most common, but there's some research chemicals on there. Definitely not something people do very much, but some people try it. The average dosages, the LSD was 13.5 micrograms, psilocybin 300 milligrams. But as you can see over in this column, the ranges are pretty big, right? 50 micrograms for LSD and 1.5 grams for mushrooms. Definitely not a microdose, but those are probably outliers because the averages are still with pretty close to the kind of typical microdose range. But anyway, so they gave them some questionnaires. Again, they screened out psychiatric disorders. But this one, the thing that I pulled out of this was they talked a lot about the default mode network. And this is something I'm going to get much deeper into in a little bit. But their conclusions was basically that what we know about macrodoses effects on the default mode network being suppressed with psychedelics. They had this idea that these microdosing regimens could be good preparation for those higher dose situations where you're really kind of taken out of your normal state of mind. So yeah, we'll talk more about that later. But and then, so this one was one of the ones where they controlled for the expectation of getting it and the previous microdosing experience. And they found that it didn't affect it a whole lot. They didn't find statistical significance for that there. So this is one piece of evidence that would lend to the effects of microdosing being somewhat independent of those kinds of situations. So let's look more at what were the things they were asking them about. So it was a number of things, some of them kind of more vague and hard to describe, like mysticism, absorption, involuntariness. But some of these things I would expect actually people to believe that microdosing would kind of help with. Like mindfulness is kind of a big thing in like the New Age spirituality realm, and psychedelics sometimes have been associated with that. But the graphs here, basically, if the baseline, the red and the blue, are on the same level, then there wasn't a whole lot of change. But as you can see, measures of depression seem to go down, stress seemed to go down, mind wandering seemed to go down, neuroticism seemed to go up, absorption, whatever that means, seemed to go up, and then effortlessness had some statistical significance. So a little bit, it's this one, it's kind of all over the place. Some things there wasn't a whole lot of change that maybe you would expect it, but then other things did seem to change. However, I would definitely point to at least placebo effect playing a role in a lot of this, because if somebody is seeking out microdosing because they have depression, are they more or less likely to say that the microdosing helped them with their depression? Probably more likely. So placebo could be involved in that. Jessica?
I was just wondering with the mind wandering, so looking for anything that was going down, could that be like people with ADHD or something?
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was. Yeah, ADD, ADHD. Or that could be, this will be kind of more the discussion of default mode network stuff. It's like when that default mode kicks in, that's your mind just kind of going through, whatever mundane things about yourself. And if what we know about psychedelics suppressing that part of our brain is true, then the mind wandering, it would make sense to go down. So that could be it. Yeah.
Top right, QOLI.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't remember. Oh, nice. All right. Thank you. Quality of life.
What's
So,
gas absorption?
what's that? Absorption? Okay, I think I kind of remember how they described that. Like the tendency to like the opposite of that would be not paying attention to what's around you or not being sensitive to things.
Like an awareness?
Some kind of awareness, I suppose, or maybe
Able to process information?
I don't know if it's processing so much as
It's like getting caught up, isn't it? Isn't that kind of
maybe. I can't say for sure. Yeah.
So in like personality trait theory or whatever, absorption is a trait that just means you regularly fall into states of being completely absorbed in what you're doing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Or flow state.
Flow state, yeah. Or like some kind of focus maybe too. Nice, thank you. Cool, yeah, so yeah, let's keep going. There's another big one to look at. So this one is also looking at the differences between the microdosing day and the days they weren't microdosing, specifically the 2 days after that they're not taking the microdose. And so as maybe you would expect, the microdosing day, they do report the effects to be increased. Although I have to say, anecdotally, I've heard people say that their off days, they feel pretty good on too. So take this with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, this would support, again, the idea that the microdoses are actually having a real effect, and it's not just you thinking they do. Okay, so next study. This was an interview study. They basically just called people up that were recruited from online forums. And so you had a pretty big spread of doses and substances. People were mostly taking, again, mushrooms or LSD, again, in the typical below threshold or threshold range. And just some reports were common of people doing the off days, but also taking breaks. Does anybody have a comment about like why it would make sense to stop microdosing for weeks or months? Aaron?
See how long it lasts or how effective it was without it.
So to compare, basically, you know, how do I feel while I'm doing my regimen and when I'm not doing my regimen?
You want to see if they're reliant on it or not.
Yeah, or yeah, that too, yeah. People worrying that they're too dependent on the microdoses. Yeah, any other ideas on that? Oh, it could be access too. Yeah, they just run out. Yeah, they don't sell this stuff at the drugstore. No.
Why they were taking breaks?
Yeah. This people often reported in this study that they would stop doing it for periods of weeks or months at a time. Yeah. Qualitatively, people were reporting relief from various mental illnesses. Again, placebo effect is definitely a factor here because these people are probably taking the microdoses because they know they already have depression or social anxiety. But nonetheless, people seem pretty happy with the results, which is interesting. There was some reports that mushrooms in particular relieve chronic pain and migraines. And there are some pretty good studies on cluster headaches with psilocybin mushrooms. Those are some of the earlier studies, and they seem to be some of the most effective drugs for cluster headaches and potentially migraines, which are similar to cluster headaches. They did note that, well, in one case, LSD relieved someone of their narcolepsy, which is interesting because no, it makes. I was thinking the opposite, but narcolepsy would be like falling asleep when you don't want to fall asleep, and so again, that kind of lends to the phenomena of LSD being a more stimulating psychedelic, also longer lasting, and but with that, you know, if you take your microdose of LSD too late in the day, you might not end up being able to fall asleep, and so there was definitely reports of insomnia when they were doing their LSD microdoses, but the negative effects were reported most often to be because they just took too much, or you know, maybe they just didn't have a good way of measuring it, which is very common with microdosing. So this again sort of validates a lot of the anecdotal reports. Okay, so I think this is one more survey study here. This one, honestly, it wasn't terribly interesting in terms of the subjective reports. Similar to what we've heard, but they specifically said there wasn't a huge amount of statistical significance. But what was interesting was the where they got their data from. They made a graph specifically about how many subscribers to the microdosing subreddit there was. And they made this note because if you look at the graph, in 2014, this subreddit was started. If you don't know what Reddit is, it's basically one of the biggest online forums out there. And in a matter of 4 years, 25,000 people subscribed to this subreddit. But even more than that, at the time that they published this, they went back to the subreddit and found that it had jumped up to 40,000 people. So almost doubled in 1 year. So we're talking exponential interest growth in microdosing right now. So beyond whatever evidence there is for whether or not this is actually helping people, the sheer fact that the interest in microdosing has gone up exponentially in just a few years is incredible. I mean, there really isn't a whole lot in terms of like drug use like this out there right now. So, that's reason enough to take a closer look. Yeah.
Kind of a tangent, but I think it's great because, a lot of people thought, well, if I don't want to go absolutely crazy, I should just stay away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is bringing in a whole group of people that would have never even thought about it because they're saying, well, I can just take a little bit and then,
Yeah, good point. Yeah, because the stigma for psychedelics is massive, right? The drug war did an excellent job of instilling the fear that psychedelics will make you go crazy forever.
You just go to some dealer, he's going to say, take this much.
Right.
Take a ton.
Yeah.
He's not going to say, oh, take a little bit every day. In 6 months, Yeah.
Psychedelic evangelism, love it. Yeah.
Are you seeing a lot of scientific studies that are citing Reddit as kind of
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all these survey studies are using Reddit or some other online forum. Yeah.
There's also a woman recently, I don't remember what her name is, but she wrote the book, A Really Good Day, I think it's called.
Yeah, well, I'm actually covering her, yeah.
Ever taken a high dose.
Yeah.
Ever. And she's written a book on microdosing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's getting out to the people who never would have thought they would have touched psychedelics. Yeah.
Isn't there a correlation also between how many people are actually subscribing to or know about Reddit or Reddit's
Okay.
popularity?
That's
proportionate to the
Yeah, good scientific question. So the question was, could this exponential increase in Reddit's, the microdosing subreddit subscribers be because Reddit in general has been growing in interest? And I can't say for sure. I know Reddit's definitely been around a lot longer than this subreddit has been around though. So I would say that could be somewhat of a factor, but definitely not like the whole story there.
Subreddits, and how fast they've grown, and that'd be a good way to do it.
Yeah, that would be cool to find out. And
Just look at the total number of Reddit users over time. And
Yeah.
how that trajectory compares to this one. What about other ones like Shroomery or?
Yeah, good question. I mean, these studies didn't. This is the only study that actually took any interest in how many people were on these online forums. But yeah, these are all good questions. I hope that somebody goes out there and does a little bit more research, not just on the effects of microdosing, but like how many people are talking about this, who's talking about this. That would be really cool to find out.
It's funny, that group's up to 93,000 now.
Yeah, you just checked it? There you go. Yep.
I guess we could say it's 2020.
So yeah, more than doubled in 1 year there. Yeah, over here and then Brandon.
So that curve, I just want to point out that there's this thing from network science called power log. That follows a power log distribution.
Power log.
Scale free, if you zoom out, the curve still looks exactly the same, and it indicates that it's going to continue to grow like that for a fair amount of time.
Okay, yeah. Interesting, yeah, Brandon.
And Reddit grew its user base by 30% as of 2 weeks ago in the last year. So
Okay, so there is.
End of 18 to end of 19, 30% user growth, which I think this would be at a higher acceleration than that.
Oh, okay. So it would indicate that Reddit subscribers in general wouldn't necessarily account for the growth of this particular
We're talking
subreddit.
about a 30% overall growth versus this is 50%, like it's doubling every year.
Yeah,
So Reddit's growing really fast, but this is
growing faster. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you. Love having computers on hand to. Yeah, and please, I love the fact checking. There's definitely way too many facts here for me to try and figure out. Okay, so one more survey study, but this one took kind of a different approach and tried cataloging the different subjective effects based on importance reported by the users. So they wouldn't just ask them, was your mood improved, but how important to you was the fact that your mood improved? And same with the challenges of microdosing, or in other words, reasons maybe you wouldn't microdose. And so it's no surprise that the legality or illegality of microdosing is by far the largest factor in the reason why people wouldn't maybe want to microdose. But as you can see, there's some others. It's interesting to point out that anxiety is both in the challenges and, where is it? Yeah, over here, and about the similar proportions. So again, could make it worse, could make it better. A lot of factors there.
Just break it down by substance.
By what?
Substance.
Uh,
Like LSD versus psilocybin.
I'm guessing not because is a sample of 278, and this was again online forums and stuff. So, but one thing that I pulled out of this was when you look at the challenges, illegality, social interference, physiological discomfort, the anxiety, even the mood issues, increased symptoms. If you were to be able to calibrate your microdose just perfectly, right? Like finding that ideal dose where it's below threshold, so you're not having any kind of impairment, but you're still getting whatever benefits are there. A lot of that stuff could, be minimized. And so the challenges of microdosing I sort of see as more of not a matter of the drugs themselves, but just the fact that we're dealing with uncontrolled substances, we're dealing with a very difficult to measure dosing. So if you imagine sort of an ideal world where microdosing or psychedelics are 100% legal and maybe microdoses are available over the counter, then a lot of these negative effects of microdosing could be minimized. So again, we're in the Wild West here. Things are not easy. Yes.
Again, I don't want to get off too much of a tangent, but it'd be interesting to see microdosing like every day as part of like a vitamin regimen versus I take a microdose like someone would take anti-anxiety for a specific situation or a specific time if something were to, it'd be interesting to see microdosing in that broad range.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Cool. So let's, one more thing on this study. There was the questions about how it affected their behavior. So are you drinking more or less? Are you having more or less anxiety, etc.? I circled just the more significant ones, but typically people are reporting improvements on these things. So drinking less or using less caffeine or other substances. Some of them are kind of interesting. Anxiety seemed to go up more often. So again, there's that issue of anxiety right there, worth looking into more. Yeah, Brandon?
Improved behaviors with the purple triangle.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, okay. So anxiety more often than not improved.
I saw the same thing. I was like, oh, that's not good.
Right on. Yeah, way above 50% there would have been bad. But okay, so improvements. So the purples are improvements. Exercise. People are meditating more. Mood by far the best improved thing. So and compared to the other studies, mood seemed to be the thing people were taking it for intentionally too. So, okay, so let's get into a little bit about who's talking about this. right? Who's getting on TV, doing interviews, writing articles, and doing podcasts about this? Fadiman, he was kind of the guy microdosing fad. I'm not going to read these things. I mainly just put these quotes up there just to sort of illustrate how much he loves this stuff. Like, he really just thinks this is the best thing in the world. And again, he's not the most rigorous scientist out there, but he did, he did some work on it. And so, what he says has some kind of validity. But, oh yeah, and he wrote that book too, Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Tim Ferriss, another very vocal person about microdosing. Also, a big podcaster. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have come to the Psychedelic Society because Tim Ferriss told them about psychedelics. So, he has some recognition. He's really rich. So, he knows, he rubs elbows with those types of people. And that's kind of what I think is interesting about this is, psychedelics seem to be a sort of a drug of privilege. The most kind of high up people in society seem to really love this stuff. Also, another thing he said, unlike almost every other kind of medication, psychedelics have very different effects at different dose levels, almost as if they're different substances altogether. And that's really kind of fascinating, right? Like especially comparing a microdose to a really, really high dose, like DMT specifically. You take one hit of DMT, the things are a little bit more colorful, walls are melting a little bit. You take 2 hits, you're verging on incapacitation. You take 3 and you're totally knocked out of your body into a different dimension. So a lot of different potential applications here. But the other interesting thing about what Tim Ferriss talks about is he uses ibogaine. That's his microdose of choice. Ibogaine, if you're not familiar with, is definitely a lesser well-known psychedelic. It comes from a root of the iboga plant, which is apparently only grown in one place in Africa, but has become sort of famous for its apparent ability to get people off of addictive drugs, like opiates in particular. But the reason he chose ibogaine was because he's not a fan of LSD. I mean, as far as what I read, is just because he's not a big fan of synthetics, maybe side effects or whatever. But he likes mushrooms, but finds the dosing too difficult. Again, potentially due to a lot of factors with mushrooms, different species having different potencies and whatnot. But, that kind of leaves not a whole lot of options in terms of your classical psychedelics, but apparently ibogaine really works for him. So that's kind of something interesting to look into. And the other thing I think is really strange about this is how openly he talks about using Schedule I substances. Ibogaine is legal in other parts of the world, but in the United States, it's definitely 100% illegal. So I don't know. I maybe just because he's so rich, he can just do whatever he wants. I'm not sure, but there you go. So some people talk about it. Some people are a little bit more low key.
Well, I think you can talk about it, but it's just the issue of I'm going to go do drugs right now.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is if you're talking about some experience you had, that's different. But microdosing is I'm doing this right now. I have my ibogaine pills in my back pocket, ready to go. Like to me, that's kind of where you cross the line. That's where it's if you look hard enough, you can figure out, find the paper trail where he's sourcing it and, potentially prosecute him for, using Schedule I substances. So
I guess if the DEA really wanted to dig in on this, they just follow him.
I know, that's what I'm thinking, right? But he's doing his thing. He's got a huge podcast where he's doing a whole lot of psychedelic talks. So maybe that's a good sign, though. Maybe that's a sign that the time's changing, that the DEA is maybe not as concerned about psychedelics as other drugs. So, Aaron, what's up?
I just want to make a quick note about kind of appreciating some of these people for sticking their neck out on the line.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
About this very openly, especially with Schedule I substances and just being just putting it out there, saying that they do it. I think part of it might be is it's hard to talk to people with a lot of money. So
Mm-hmm.
can get dragged through the court systems for quite some time.
Yeah.
There's also a little bit of possible deniability, yeah, like talking about it in the past and maybe just like, well, it was for entertainment value, how like some musicians talk about it these things, but
True, right. Yeah, he probably doesn't regularly talk about how he's microdosing, but I think this was in his book or something, so it's somewhere, but.
Yeah, the fact that they make an effort to talk about it, with fear of being persecuted, he could just shut his mouth and not tell anybody, and he'd just do this, in which I'm sure lots of people have throughout, but it's nice to see.
Yeah, it's nice to see, and that's again why I'm bringing this into the presentation, because these are just a few individuals, but these individuals are very vocal. They're very public about this stuff. So
it's interesting that a lot of these substances have kind of this call to action too. Like I can't just keep this to myself.
Yeah.
A lot of these are like, dude, I gotta tell. Oh my God, I gotta tell everyone about this. I'm seeing people struggle with the same things. Like they need access.
Yeah.
What that is, that's very prevalent that you bring that up.
Right.
People come into the Psychedelic Society and it's just like, you just want to talk about it ad nauseum and let everyone know, and like, what is it doing to us?
Yeah.
That it makes us
I feel like you discovered a secret.
Yeah, I was like, oh, something that somebody doesn't want me to know about. But yeah, people are figuring it out. And I mean, I guess we're all sort of at fault for that right now. Thank you for doing that, everyone here as well. So keep up the evangelism. So Paul Stamets, another very vocal guy who's kind of been a face of microdosing, particularly with his stacked microdosing method. This he actually applied for a patent for, so he is planning on taking an entrepreneurial approach to this. Dude wants to make money off of microdoses, and it is interesting what he's stacking with though. So it's lion's mane, niacin, and psilocybe mushrooms. So his argument, and I don't know of any science to totally validate this. I know there are definitely studies on lion's mane and its neuroregenerative properties. But in terms of the combination, so he argues that since psilocybin, much like all psychedelics, have a neuridogenetic effect. In other words, it can grow the branches of your brain cells, allowing for more connections. Whereas lion's mane can actually grow entirely new brain cells. So together, the two theoretically could be a very powerful neuroregenerative combination. And then he says the niacin is effective as a distributive agent, where could be used for what was it when neuropathy, right? When your extremities kind of lose nerve, so regrowing nerves. But he said something about crossing the blood-brain barrier easier with niacin. So maybe it could apply to like brain injury or Alzheimer's, something like that. I'm just guessing, but the questions really kind of start coming in when you consider the properties of these individual things. Yeah, Aaron.
I need someone to confirm this, but I also think you mentioned that niacin is, like nicotinic acid specifically, reduces some of like the visual effects or like impairment from psilocybin as well.
Huh.
I've seen his patent for it, and it's ridiculous as well among psilocybin, so it's not like it would really do anything anyway, but I think that's just one of the extra reasons why niacin is there.
Interesting. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah. The way I heard him refer to it, so he's talking about like putting this into a formulation, like one dose is like whatever milligram of psilocybin, whatever milligram of niacin, and then so the niacin would prevent you from taking enough to get to a point where it's hallucinogenic, because niacin is super uncomfortable. If anybody's ever had a niacin flush, and so you couldn't take like 30 of them and then have a psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
Well, you could, but you feel super bad. And so it was like a prevention of abuse, if that's what he called it. I don't remember the word, but yeah.
So that could be the over-the-counter FDA argument, right? Yeah. But yeah, Brandon, then over here.
I just kind of got a shameless plug. offers products, and I work at Forest and the Fork at Keg and Case in St. Paul, where they grow the mushrooms in the chamber there.
Nice.
And they have his products.
Okay.
And lion's mane and all that stuff.
Right on. Cool, cool. Yeah, Brandon, what's up? Lion's mane's legal. Yeah, yeah. If you know where to buy mushrooms, please don't say that at this point.
I was going to say the same thing Brian said.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So the niacin, yeah, potentially acting more as an agent of preventing macrodosing with the psilocybin.
I'm taking his Stamets 7.
Okay, what's in that one?
It's 7 different kinds of mushrooms.
Cool.
But I heard it on that Tim Ferriss podcast, so I thought, well, I'll have to give it a try.
Right on.
I do that transcendental meditation.
Nice.
And it seems like the video, the pictures are getting more so than they were before. I don't know.
The pictures? What do you mean?
Visual imagery.
Visual imagery.
Oh, while you're meditating?
Yeah.
Oh, cool, cool. All right. That's cool.
He
Yeah.
makes medicine from the actual mycelium as well as the fruit, which is kind of a fun fact there. So
Okay.
Products, yeah.
He's the mushroom guy for sure, yeah.
That's legal, right? That's not.
Yeah, the only thing illegal here is the psilocybin. Yeah.
Are there studies that show that neurogenesis happens with lion's mane?
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of fMRI or?
I couldn't say. I don't know for sure.
Studies, you can't really track that in a human.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to do slice between later, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think they measured an increase in NGF,
Nerve growth factor.
Growth factor, yeah.
Okay.
I think that's where it comes from. They've done a lot of studies with, in Japan, with people with cognitive disorders, with their cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's. And they were taking like 3 grams per day for 3 months or something. And the elderly population saw massive improvements.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Which is
what?
3 grams of lime.
Or dried mushroom?
Yeah, it's just dried powder.
Okay. Cool, cool. Yeah, and it's also maybe notable to point out lion's mane looks a little bit like what we got in our heads. So there's nature doing its thing. Yeah, it's a cross section. Yep. Yeah. It's a beautiful mushroom. It basically looks like a little fur ball. Yeah.
It's like the cerebellum or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they taste pretty good too. I would recommend the fresh mushrooms for sure. Most your co-ops do sell lion's mane fresh, and it's great. Chop it up, throw it on the saute pan, or throw it in some soup.
You can eat every day, or?
Well, I don't see why not. Yeah. In fact, I think you should eat some kind of mushroom every day, right? Yeah, mushrooms.
And they grow in the forest here.
Yeah. Oh, here. Then all right. Cool.
I find them every year.
What time of year you can find lion's mane?
Beginning of August to mid-September.
Okay. All right. That's
outside of that, but that's typical.
all right.
You don't know the guy who eats a lot of lion's mane every day. You have a head like a basketball.
Only one way to find out. Cool, cool. So Stamets also recently announced a microdosing app. You can download it right now if you've got an iPhone. Unfortunately, Android is coming soon, so I haven't tried this one out myself, but apparently there's little like cognitive tests and surveys along with tracking your microdoses. But it's also serving the purpose of sending the data to a future study that I don't know who exactly will be conducting the study, but pretty cool though, so check it out. Microdose.me would be the website there, and then Quantified Citizen is the name of the app. So, yeah, good stuff there. And there was another self-blinding microdosing study that they recently closed the window for submissions, but that hopefully will be published in the next coming years too. So that one was kind of another sort of revolution in terms of survey studies, self-reporting, because a lot of the survey studies that I covered here today was researchers actively like recruiting, whereas this is an approach that could potentially draw from much larger populations of people, because anybody with a phone app and a desire to source their own microdoses can be a subject in the study. So costs a lot less money to do that. You get a lot more data. So we should know a little bit more about microdosing in the near future. So Paul Austin, another kind of key figure, I can't remember his background exactly, but he's got this website now, The Third Wave. Honestly, I'm a little jealous at how like thorough of an educational resource it is. He's pretty good about citing scientific studies to back up what he says. I will say that he definitely inserts a bit of his own anecdotal opinions in there, but he's usually pretty transparent as far as what is based on evidence and what isn't. But he has a particularly strong interest in microdosing, so much so that he created a microdosing course. Costs $100. I haven't done it myself, but seems interesting. And he argues that microdosing is sort of a bridge to these more altered states of consciousness that your macrodoses would give rise to. However, he has been kind of, he has encountered a little bit of backlash with part of the psychedelic community, particularly the people who are more evangelical about the high dose experiences. You know, it's that question of, do I need to microdose if I can just get a really great macrodose experience? You know, what is the microdosing really doing if I can just get everything I need out of one awesome experience, right? And so that's kind of, I think that's a really good thing to consider in this world of microdosing. It's like, are we just treating symptoms? You know, are we just doing the same thing as all of our existing drugs, just with maybe less side effects? Or are we really kind of reaching deep, digging deep, and like going back into like unresolved traumas and rewiring our brains? And so there's definitely some differing opinions there, and I think that's definitely worth thinking a little bit more deeply about. You know, what do you really want to get out of the psychedelics, and is microdosing just you know, just kind of a cheap way of getting a little bit of something that maybe you need a lot of? And so things to consider there. And then Iolette Waldman, as one of our guests mentioned, she made the rounds in the press after a short story she wrote about herself, basically a self-experiment. She suffered from major depression and suicidality, and described the effects of her microdosing of LSD to basically make it all good. Like she spoke very highly about it, and she talks a lot about the differences between her SSRI treatment and the microdosing, and just says that, you know, I get what I want out of it without the way she puts it is I don't gain weight and I don't lose my sex drive. So those, you know, are potentially pretty serious side effects. So yeah, so that's a story you can check out. Yeah, please.
Well, I feel like her argument in particular is one that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about like why people are coming out and talking about it now.
Okay,
It's like
yeah.
just so desperate for treatment, and if you've ever had long-term depression, I mean, it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that there's something that can help pull somebody out of that, like you want to tell everybody.
Awesome.
You want to help like the world, and I wonder if that's not kind of what's motivating people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, based on the way she speaks about it, you know, I think that's why she kind of made a name in this realm of microdosing, because she's coming from the heart. You know, she really, really cares, and she wants people to know. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, was there a hand over here?
Maybe the microdosing part of that. They're used to taking thousands of milligrams of this and that, and this pill and that pill. I only have to take one tiny little thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it just seems like
And without the side effects.
more with less. Exactly.
Yeah.
More with less.
Yeah, and the other thing I remember from one of the talks she gave was she really kind of illustrated this this coming from a place of never knowing, like never even thinking she would get into psychedelics, and not even wanting to do it, and describing how it sort of hit her, that something was happening, and it was more subtle than maybe you would think. It was the way she described it was she would just go about her day, right? But here and there, she would just kind of notice some sort of mundane aspect of her day, like a plant sitting on her desk, and just getting a little bit of happiness out of something that simple, and then that just sort of being this phenomenon that sort of carries over into everything. And that's, I think, what she means by a really good day. You know, it's nothing terribly special. You're just not stuck in those depressive patterns of thinking all the time. And so, yeah.
How psychedelics stop and smell the nose is medicine.
Yeah, right? You're appreciating just the little things. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I'm hearing them.
we often think about the mind and like psychedelics as like a brain experience, but people don't realize that there's a whole lot of the nervous system like spread out throughout the body. So if you basically get heightened connections throughout your body, now you're releasing like serotonin and in other parts of your body that then reach your brain, and so
Yeah, so there's more going on than just whatever the drug is doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah.
I was gonna say, she specifically said when she stopped microdosing, her symptoms came back over the course of 4 to 8 weeks.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's something that came out of some of the anecdotal reports and the surveys as well. Yeah, the microdosing only seems to work within a short window of the time that you're actually taking it. And again, that's, symptom management, right? We're not using the psychedelics in that case to really go to the root of a problem, rewire your thinking so that, you can then go on with your life. It seems to be more so symptom management. Potentially though, I think it's also notable that people who aren't sick are taking microdosing for other reasons too, right? Maybe enhance your creativity or your spirituality or something like that too. So, sorry, say again? Biohacking, yeah, that kind of a thing. Yeah, so there's definitely other possibilities there, but yeah.
I think one of the big things with microdosing is people aren't looking for altered states, they're looking for altered traits.
Altered traits, not altered states.
That's actually a quote about the spiritual life from Huston Smith. He said, well, spiritual life is not altered states, but altered traits.
Cool.
I think that's what everyone's looking for with this. They want less anxiety, they want more creativity, they want less depression, they want more drive and passion and gratitude, higher quality of life. But they don't want to take an SSRI every day.
Yeah.
It feels like altering your state once a day, or like the anxiety in the moment, like taking something for each individual moment versus like looking to change some deeper aspect about them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're right about the root symptom though, because sometimes it's like you're getting those altered traits with microdosing, but if you can't dive all the way in and figure out like what's at the root of it, then 4 days later it sort of drops off.
Right.
But I also wonder if that's possibly kind of its own sort of placebo effect, like, oh, I stopped doing it, therefore it's not going to get me over, it's not going to continue. So,
yeah.
Just interesting to test for that.
Yeah, good points. Good points. It's very cheap, yeah. Well, for now, once the pharmaceutical companies get a hold of it, we'll see. But yeah.
I wonder though, over time, does it lose potency?
Well, one of the, as you were saying, people tending to take off days because of the buildup of tolerance, because that is definitely the case with psychedelics. If you take it every day or if you take it in larger amounts, it will be less effective as time goes on. So, but apparently the metabolism in your body can sort of reset that pretty quickly. So it doesn't seem to be a huge issue. But in terms of, hard to say, none of the studies that we talked about here, looked at long-term anything. So that's definitely a question worth asking. Yeah.
There's some critics coming out against LSD microdosing for the fact that it binds this 5-HT2B receptor,
Right.
which causes cardiovascular problems.
Right.
I don't know if the science is super well fleshed out on that, but it's something that people are a little concerned about.
Yeah, and like the issue of like it binding so hard to the receptor it causes damage or something like that.
Locks into it.
Right.
Just basically just continually stimulating it.
Yeah, and Dennis McKenna, who has spoken at our Psychedelic Society events a couple times, he's pretty vocal about not being a fan of LSD microdosing. And I mean, he's the plant guy, but still, that says something. I saw a question, back over there,
Yeah. So earlier in the slide, you were saying, and Paul's saying about new neural pathways being generated by psilocybin. So is that directly related with dosage size? Like if you get a very heavy dose, is it pretty clear that there's going to be a greater quantity of neural pathways generated than long-term microdosing?
Good question. So the question is the neuroregenerative effects of psychedelics dose response, or what's the term I'm looking for?
Dose dependent.
Dose dependent. Yeah. And I don't know. I am about to get into some studies that do talk about that, but I don't remember seeing dose responsiveness being a part of that. Yeah.
It's a question for Jessica, but is that the same receptor that people say MDMA is, and then that also is the same as with the cardiovascular?
I'm not sure. I don't know much about the pharmacology of MDMA. I know it acts more like an SSRI, where it helps prevent more available serotonin rather than activating serotonergic receptors. But I don't know about 5-HT2B specifically.
5-HT2 is DMT. So this is the same receptor for DMT.
2A applies to.
2A, we're talking about 2B.
2B, oh.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So 5-HT1A is what the SSRIs or what your serotonin receptors are targeting. When you take an SSRI, it's really trying to create more serotonin so it can bind to 1A. And then psychedelics are really the only thing, like LSD, psilocybin, DMT are the only ones that really bind and activate 1 or 2A. And then there's this cardiovascular thing with 2B that I don't know a whole lot about. Just that it can increase heart rate.
Sal.
Been any studies that have used things like 5-HTP?
Oh, the studies I don't know, but I have heard. We talked about this briefly. What's it? 5H.
5-HTP is just basically like a precursor for serotonin. So
Right.
it's depleted in serotonin, like after you've done a big MDMA night.
Right. So that doesn't apply to the tryptamines, right?
Serotonin is a tryptamine.
Right, but
5-HTP is a precursor.
But something about we were saying like that would apply to MDMA, but not the tryptamines because it doesn't use up your serotonin or something like that.
Right. So it's basically acting like serotonin and binding
Okay.
to the receptor, whereas MDMA is sort of like exhausting your own serotonin.
There it is. Yeah. So.
In terms of microdosing, taking 5-HTP.
Well, if you're microdosing mushrooms, that's a tryptamine, so it wouldn't deplete your serotonin supply. LSD, what does that apply to? LSD, neither. So it wouldn't. It doesn't seem it would help.
It's basically just making serotonin not do what it should be doing.
Okay, but that doesn't mean you're depleting serotonin. So the 5-HTP wouldn't necessarily counterbalance that.
You want to add serotonin to your system.
With
I think it depends on the binding affinity of LSD or psilocybin versus serotonin, and what your receptor is going to prefer. I think if given the option, it's going to prefer LSD.
Yeah.
Than psilocybin.
Yeah. So just having more serotonin wouldn't necessarily mean you're getting more.
Serotonin doesn't bind to 5-HT2A.
Oh, okay.
As far as I know.
Just psychedelics, huh?
Yeah.
It's the magic receptor. Brian?
Just to touch on that, yeah. So 5-HTP has like a tolerance and actually like a rebound of anxiety and like all this stuff with long-term usage. So I don't know about microdosing, but I don't think it's definitely indicated for long-term usage.
Okay.
I would definitely not do that.
Yeah, over here.
Anecdotally, a friend of mine told me that when he was on Zoloft, he didn't notice psilocybin as much.
I've heard that too. SSRIs seem to diminish the effects of psychedelics. Anyone else have experience with that?
As well.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone with experience, and they try to increase somebody that does like retreats and stuff, and they usually try to increase the dosage if somebody has had long-term extended use of SSRIs.
Yeah, that seems to be what I've heard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some competition there.
That lasts after the effect, because SSRIs modify the brain.
It lasts after the effect.
Mm.
That's what she related to me.
That would make sense. Yeah, your entire neurochemistry has got to shift back after the SSRI treatment.
A lot of
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's get into the neuroscience here. Seems like we're already kind of itching to do that anyway. So the default mode network. This is kind of a big hot topic with psychedelics, and for good reason. There's a number of studies that are looking at this specifically. And really it's because psychedelics have a dramatic effect on the default mode network. And we also know quite a bit more about what the default mode network does in our brain as of recently. So its application to mental illness is pretty well studied. There's probably a lot more to learn, but we'll take a look here what the default mode network does. Think of it as self-referral. This is you thinking about you, right? This is what do you want? What do you not want? What do you want to do? You're planning. What kind of relationships do you want to have? What kind of life do you want to have? It's any time you are just sitting around thinking, what's up with my life? Just going through the everything from incredibly mundane to really abstract, like big dreams of your life, even fantasies. And they call the default mode for a reason, because we default back to it anytime we can, anytime we have the opportunity. This is where our mind wants to go, and so you think of it as like you're constantly reverting back to it. You're daydreaming, you're introspecting, and so as you would expect, this is most often activated when you're just chilling, when you are sitting in an elevator, just waiting, or if you're just sitting around twiddling your thumbs, or if you're just kind of zoned out, watching TV or something. Maybe not so much when you're watching TV, but the other important thing about the default mode network is it has a very powerful suppression of other networks in the brain. It's very demanding. It's very energy consumptive. If you're doing self-referral, you're probably not doing anything else. Your brain is not concerned with a whole lot else. It's not allowing it. This is kind of what they refer to as the reduction valve. The default mode network is kind of limiting and filtering anything else that is potentially coming through your senses, your memories. It's controlling what makes it, and probably for good reason, because at some point you do need to kind of self-check yourself, right? You need to kind of evaluate where are you at in life. What are you doing? What do you want to do? But it is notable that this is definitely not always happening, because if you're sitting around thinking about all your stuff, you never get anything done, right? And so it's specifically when your sensory cortices, when your motor cortices are active, anytime you're actively doing a task, the default mode network chills out, takes a back seat. But as you could maybe imagine, you're not constantly doing something demanding, and so you do actually spend quite a bit of your day in the default mode network, or at least with it somewhat activated. But also, before I get into mental illnesses, I want to point out that this issue gets complex really quick. The brain is something where you don't just have like one part of the brain giving rise to a cognitive process. It's more often multiple parts of the brain working together, having some kind of functional connectivity, and that's what gives rise to the huge variety of cognitive processes. And so it's not just the default mode network doing its thing. There's interconnectedness in the default mode network, like there's the medial prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, parietal something. I'm not good at those names, but a lot of different things going on just within the default mode network. But then also the default mode network interacting with other networks gives rise to other cognitive processes. So it gets complicated very fast, but I do want to point out a few examples that can maybe sort of help illustrate what the heck the default mode network is doing and what might happen if it's not really working as in an ideal way. So one of them being hyperconnectivity within the default mode network, within certain parts of the default mode network, could end up causing you to get stuck in that self-referential thinking, so much so that maybe you're ruminating about all your problems, you're thinking about what's wrong with you too much, you just can't get out of that. This would be when you're depressed, right? And so you can start to think, where the default mode network could maybe be applied or maybe be tweaked to help you out with your mental illnesses. And then another one would be like the default mode network interacting with executive control. This is where your prioritization goes. What's most important in my life to keep things going good. And one study talked about the default mode network interacting with these executive control centers in addicted people. So you can imagine that's when you're prioritizing things less in terms of what's really good for you and maybe more in terms of what you want to have right now. So you can also think in terms of default mode network interacting a little too much with your attention and sensory. This paper, I didn't fully absorb it all, but I PTSD in terms of that inner world, your self-referential mind kind of coming outwards into your sensory awareness. That's maybe when you start thinking something is happening that isn't really happening based on a memory or an emotion. You're sort of externalizing what's inside of you. So there's some good papers there to look at. Also, though, I think this illustrates a little bit more about how the default mode network needs to really be balanced with competing cognitive processes. One being attention. So again, that's anything that requires your external awareness, your senses, your motor function. This isn't really, it doesn't go well with the default mode network. If you're busy daydreaming, you're not going to do a good job at any kind of external task out there. So there's sort of this seesaw effect with the two. And ideally, this is exactly what we want to have. We want to be able to pop in and out of our default mode network. That's the ideal situation. But then take a situation where maybe that's not happening too well, again, where your sort of self-referential thought is bleeding into competing activities, then you got some issues there, right? So that default mode network can really be problematic. If there's too much of it at the wrong times, you could be in a situation where you're not functioning well, you're unhappy, or you're just you're getting stuck in thought processes that are not serving you. So this is kind of where the idea of psychedelics come in, because again, psychedelics have a very powerful suppressive effect on the default mode network. And so as you see here, the resting state activity with no psychedelics, the brain's pretty chill, there's not a whole lot of kind of peripheral stuff going on. It's just the default mode network doing its thing. You're just thinking about your day. You're thinking about what you want to do, what you don't want to do. And again, the default mode network is very demanding. It doesn't allow for other parts of the brain to be active while it's doing its thing. But if you forcibly shut off the default mode network, those constraints are lifted. The rest of the brain then sort of has the freedom of turning on. And so that's what we see. And not only that, but you also have more connections between those parts of the brain. So that's what this figure is showing. The dots around the circle are different brain networks. And then obviously the lines between them represent functional connectivity. So each line is a new cognitive process. So as you can imagine, the tripping brain is pretty busy. There's a lot of different connections going on, a lot of different ideas, new things happening. And so this is a lot of where that talk of enhanced creativity, new perceptual capabilities, novel insights come in. And this is really kind of the well of mystery with psychedelics. And yeah, please. This is blood flow. So which are you talking about, the placebo brain, or?
What is this showing right now? These pictures.
Yeah, this is functional fMRI, so yeah, blood flow pretty much, yeah.
So the default mode network, is there an area where you think it is?
It's in multiple areas. Yeah. These are slices, so it's a little hard to see exactly, which area is lit up there. But yeah, please.
This is a functional connectivity study of the primary visual cortex.
The placebo brain.
Both of them.
Primary. Okay, so you're getting that based off which parts are lit up here.
Yes.
Okay. So that wouldn't correspond to resting state activity there, or maybe so.
Yeah, no.
Okay. All right. Cool.
You kind of notice that LSD suppresses the DMN, so that the DMN suppressed would be if you look at the LSD brain, that'd be a good idea what the DMN suppressed looks like. Is that what you're getting at, kind of?
Yeah, but
I mean, there's nothing up here that says a scan of the brain while it's in attention and a scan of the brain while it's in DMN.
Is kind of what I'm asking is the area that has the DMN or the areas that we think have the DMN. Does that actually have less blood flow in the LSD brain, or is it just now equivalent to the
Oh, okay. Yeah, based on the picture, it kind of looks like the latter, where they're all sort of lit up. I can't say that 100% if that's what's going on though.
I mean, that's not just showing default mode, it's kind of just saying that everything's kind of.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not sure if this is a distinction between there's resting state and functional MRI. Resting state just means you're still gonna have the same kind of activity. Functional MRI just means you're doing some task that's specific, like you're doing an attention task or a problem.
Functional MRI is always task related then?
So,
Okay.
This is probably visual cortex, like you pointed out.
Great, okay.
Your V1 is active on the top.
Okay.
On the
I
bottom.
thought those did not reflect blood flow, but it reflected activity in general.
that's, I mean, it's kind of
Same
an
thing.
approximation of trying to figure
Yeah.
out what is activity, and I think our best guess is looking at blood flow and saying, okay, there's increased activity.
Yeah, it's
It's like water diffusion, basically, or like just how the molecules are moving around.
Okay. Yeah, and that would be like neurons firing it's the correlated neurons firing, right? Yeah. Yeah, tricky. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. I appreciate the help on that. Yeah, any other questions on this picture here?
Could that cause an aneurysm?
All that blood flow?
I don't know, maybe.
So I don't know, I mean, I would, like, we had this talk last time when Link was talking about thinking that there was maybe less blood flow in certain states, and I'm like, I mean, I feel like you have a certain amount of blood vessels in your brain, and it's just sort of how it's being distributed.
Yeah, I think it's more a matter of distribution, right?
Yeah, I mean, this would suggest that everything's lit up, so.
Yeah, because again, like the default mode or the hub networks are they kind of suck up all the energy, and so when those hub networks are disabled, you can kind of think of it as entropy theory, right? Where the energy, when allowed to, wants to dissipate, spread out. So, and that's something that Robin Carhart Harris, the guy who was the lead on this paper here, that's one of his theories, the entropic brain theory, the idea that psychedelics kind of push you over onto the more high entropy end of the spectrum, where things are more free and spread out, whereas the sober mind, tends to want to be more orderly, more focused. And the default mode network does a really good job of that, but also other hub networks definitely do too. And so that's I think one of the takeaways from this image is things are more spread out in the psychedelic brain.
Well, and also a lot of these things, it's like a statistical analysis of like looking at changes in signal compared to something else. So it might not be an actual representation of that's all blood flow.
Okay.
It depends on how the data is analyzed, and I'm not a neuroimaging expert, so.
Wow.
But I know it's like there's
Sounds.
a lot of manipulation that they do with the data to generate.
Really? Wow. Being a neuroscientist is. Where's Robin Carhart Harris when you need him? Yes, and then over here, yeah.
There's some studies that show that functional MRIs also give you an idea of cell metabolism, so ATP production, glucose uptake, which is correlated to blood flow, right? You need blood to be able to deliver glucose,
Yeah.
to sort of create the engines of thought or action.
Cool. So that's, again, sort of the energy that's required for certain parts of the brain. Yeah. So again, I think that in entropy theory applies pretty well. You know, your energy is more spread out when the constraints are lifted. When the hub networks are not filtering and focusing everything, the mind kind of goes to a naturally kind of relaxed state, so to speak, which was just kind of an interesting to say about the psychedelic state. Like, as crazy as it is, maybe it is more of a natural kind of state of mind. That's quite definitely theorizing there, but yeah, more connections. And then if you take an even closer look, the neurons themselves, there's mechanistic physical changes happening there. And this was a study where they took rat brain cells out of the rat, put them in a petri dish, and gave them psychedelics. And so the VEH, that's your control group, and then DOI, DMT, and LSD are your psychedelics. So here's where you can see new dendritic spines, new synapses forming. And these are what are necessary for making new connections. And so this is that brain plasticity thing. You know, this is very problematic in patients with PTSD, depression, addiction, OCD. So it's not terribly surprising then that psychedelics do so well in those clinical trials. And it also really says, you know, if these are neurons in a petri dish, these are neurons that are not necessarily having a psychological experience. So this is something independent from, you know, the set and setting, the whatever, you know, way you're experiencing it. Yeah.
And it gets rid of placebo in effect.
Yep, that throws that out of the window, right? Yeah. And so, you know, bringing this back to microdosing, right? This, I can't remember what the doses were on this, and I don't know, it'd probably be pretty hard to compare dosing a single neuron to a whole human, but nonetheless, you know, you can assume that if some amount of psychedelics causes this to happen, microdoses could maybe do this to some extent as well. Yeah. So those are fun pictures. I like those. But also with this study, they compared directly an endogenous hormone that is well known to do the same thing. Brain-derived neurotropic factor is something that a lot of fitness people are really into. When you exercise real hard, it plays a role in protein synthesis. It also plays a role in high stress states. I imagine also if you're just kind of like overwhelmed with like excitement about something new that you experience, you might have higher levels of BDNF. Basically, it's like that adaptive mechanism. It's anytime you need to do something a little differently, right? To look at change your physical structures. BDNF is at work, and they compared psychedelics right alongside BDNF, and they found they had very, very similar effects. And not only do they have similar effects in terms of the nerve growth, which is what the top graphs are showing. That's what the number of crossings and distance from center. Not 100% on that, but I think
they create this like sphere, like these concentric rings, and then they watch it grow out in the petri dish.
Okay, cool. So yeah, it's referring to what's happening here. The VEH, again, that's the control group, and so you're seeing the BDNF having a very similar curve as the psychedelics DOI, and then they also gave BDNF and DOI at the same time, thinking, okay, if they're operating on different mechanisms with the neuridogenesis, theoretically they should have kind of an additive effect. But they didn't see that. They found it was very similar to just giving one or the other. And so that would suggest that they're operating through the same mechanistic pathway. And even more so, they compared what would happen when you introduced a receptor antagonist, and they were both blocked. So there seems to be a very kind of natural place for psychedelics in our neurophysiology. Yeah.
And just to add to that, in the preclinical studies when they blocked BDNF, basically the benefit of the MDMA was not seen, so it didn't cure the PTSD in the rats.
Okay.
So maybe it's sort of just, it's a way to activate BDNF, and then BDNF is actually what's driving all these things.
Oh, I see. Okay. So then it's still just you doing your human body doing its thing, just with a little catalyst with the psychedelics. Then.
Is the BDNF, is that associated with like a positive stimulus? Am I understanding that right? Or is it
I don't think necessarily. No, I think it can be positive or negative stress. Yeah.
It's just a marker of activity.
Okay.
I mean, anytime you have neurons growing, there's going to be BDNF, so you can see this in pain. If you have more pain, more pain neurons, for lack of a better word, growing, you're going to see BDNF driving that.
Cool. Aaron.
Two things. What is DOI, and then what are non-chemically induced ways that BDNF is produced?
Yeah, DOI, just a lesser known lab chemical psychedelic.
It's a similar pharmacology to mescaline.
Similar to mescaline.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, sorry, what was your second question?
What are non-chemically induced ways BDNF is increased?
Oh, right. So exercise is a big one. It's involved in protein synthesis, so not just like nerve growth, but what's that?
Learning.
Oh, learning, right? Yeah. I mean, it's anytime your brain is making new connections. So stress is well known to be associated with the sort of adaptive qualities, but like I said, like maybe if you're even just really excited about something, or you're like staring at the abyss of the Grand Canyon and just having really kind of like amazing thoughts, or if you're tripping on psychedelics. So novelty, yeah, that seems to be the association with BDNF.
Have we been able to measure a cost to producing BDNF? Like if you're overly stimulated to novelty too much?
I have no idea. I would imagine.
You get too much plasticity, you could be forming connections you don't need, and if you're continually reinforcing that, like I'm using pain as an example because you don't want that to get reinforced, so too much of anything is bad.
Yeah, and I suppose could that argument be applied to like serotonin? Like if you're doing too much to induce serotonin, you could. I mean, maybe also is
serotonin syndrome is just that too much, or is that the depletion of serotonin?
And potentially the receptor affinity getting dulled if there's too much, maybe something like that.
My question was a little bit different. I'm thinking your body or mind says, okay, here's some novelty. I have to produce BDNF because it's time to change. And the act of producing BDNF from whatever molecules it used to produce that, I'm wondering if that has a cost.
Like you're depleting something else?
Oh, like whatever amino acids and.
Goes down when that goes up, essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean hormone.
You need more rest.
Yeah, hormone production requires cholesterol. I know that, and like a number of amino acids. So potentially, yeah, I would think like I know as far as like exercise goes, you definitely need to refill a lot of what is being used up to repair and potentially also to produce these extra hormones. So yeah, I would think so. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. I'm glad we got some input on that. This is dipping into an area less familiar for my territory, but nonetheless, provides a pretty good argument for, again, microdosing. Like, if we can measure this with psychedelics in general, even a little bit of this could affect, us on a daily level that could be beneficial. So, yeah, please.
It's a little abstract because I've been trying to kind of understand it, but to that point about is there something that novelty can damage? And I think it's kind of well known that like the internet is a source of unlimited novelty.
Yeah.
And there is, there's been talk about how hyper-browsing the internet or like Reddit or whatever can affect working memory.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily like a hormone, but it does have sort of an effect on the brain in terms of handling like working memory, like too much novelty, too much stimulus affects how many things you can actually focus on.
I've heard that's also a dopaminergic issue too, which does that have something to do with like blunted receptors? I mean, just having too many dopamine hits too often means that you build up a tolerance of some kind. And
I mean, you can damage it and start causing excitotoxicity or something.
yeah, I mean that's an issue in like drug addiction. So
So
yeah.
like in the earlier part you were talking about like attention and like microdosing and how attention improve, or like focus improved, like focus on tasks improved or something like that.
Oh,
Absorption. Yeah.
Divergent thinking.
Yeah, that versus divergent. Yeah. But then
Yeah.
you're thinking like if you are constantly, if microdosing or if psychedelics is a norm, then you have increased connectivity, and those connections are probably strengthened over time. So your brain learns how to connect, form cross connections. Particularly, you might eventually start seeing a distracted brain.
Yeah.
Something that finds it hard to
Too many
focus.
connections.
Too much activation.
Yeah.
Too much.
Yeah.
Network activation.
And psychedelics could.
It all depends on stimulus as well, like set and saying, like what
Right.
sets off that network.
Yeah.
Could be it too.
Yeah, because as it was shown, divergent thinking is measurably increased with
Right.
higher doses of psychedelics.
Right.
Too much divergent thinking, yeah, you can't sort of do the other side of problem solving.
So maybe that's why it's like a drug of the elite, where they can afford to be divergent. But so if you are like a rock breaker, and you can't afford to be divergent.
Yeah. Yeah, the luxury of having time to just think of stuff. Awesome point. I love that. See, this guy has some neuroplasticity, is making connections. Cool, thank you, yeah.
I can't help but think about autism spectrum disorders, right? Too much sensory overload. Here's a treatment, bring that sort of load down a little bit. I'm wondering if anybody's read anything about exploring that area.
Yeah, I don't know. Autism and psychedelics, anybody?
I mean, there's a study looking at social anxiety in autistic adults with MDMA, but that's more to treat the anxiety, not the autism.
Okay.
I mean, if it's a genetic disorder, which we don't really know.
Yeah. Maybe that's why like psychedelics are kind of contraindicated if you are like schizophrenic or have familial like psychosis, I guess, because if you have multiple personalities residing in one mind and they all become active at the same time,
right,
you might be in for trouble. So
yeah.
That's how the movie Split happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you split too much, you get superpowers, though, right?
Sounds like a Rick and Morty episode.
Yeah.
We'll just say on that comment, we had one of our members, Kitty Sipple, right? Yeah, she gave an interesting talk about how people who have psychosis may be the best prepared to actually take psychedelic journeys because they actually go through the most. So I think she makes some good points fighting back against this idea that if you have these conditions, you're somehow like in for that kind of movie. So I would highly recommend looking it up. But
what's her name?
Kitty Sipple. And
Did she talk about this at Breaking Convention?
Yeah, and she actually speaks to her own experience, and definitely really pushes back against this idea that these disorders should preclude people from. It's a very controversial idea, of course, but
yeah,
just wanted to.
Yeah, the state that science is in the early stages, they don't want to like take any risks, and it's unfortunate because that does definitely mean we miss out on some potential understandings that we'd have to wait for or rely on anecdotal evidence for. So yeah, please.
Responding to what he had said about
Autism?
About autism.
Yeah.
I saw somebody make a video about somebody's experience with autism and psychedelics.
Okay.
It was really interesting. I can't remember where it was, but I'm sure if you Google the things improved in the video.
YouTube video?
It was more of like a really spiritual experience for that person.
Okay.
But it was just one person,
Yeah.
an individual.
Well, at the very least, it seems like they made it. You know, they didn't have a terribly horrible experience. Yeah.
In regards to the hyperdosing, just like having access to unlimited stimulus whenever you want.
Yeah.
And using that, is that a case of the default mode network? Do what I want all the time. Or is that a time when the default mode network takes a backseat and you're totally absorbed in the action all the time?
Based on the study I cited, they were explaining hyperconnectivity with the default mode network and the attention or the executive function network. So too much of it sort of integrating into other parts that maybe function better on their own. That's kind of a surface level understanding of it. But again, hyperconnectivity could be within the default mode network itself. It could be with other networks. But it seems, yeah, addiction has some kind of association with the inability to properly like make those higher level prioritization decisions, which default mode network is not necessarily, you know, meant to do that. It's kind of like a bigger analysis of things, not necessarily like, oh, I need to do this for survival. You know, I need to do this to just make it in the world. So, yeah, I think it's something like that. If anyone else has a comment on that,
Has DMN ever been compared to like the Jungian ego or id?
Oh.
For 2 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a talk with a friend of mine. It was called The Neurobiology of the Ego, and we looked at exactly that, comparing Freud's psychoanalysis of the id, ego, superego, to default mode network, and what we kind of concluded was the default mode network is definitely involved with a lot of ego processes, but the id being sort of all of your instinctual stuff, your fears, your desires, your raw emotional stimuli, it feeds it. So think of it as like the id is providing the ego with stuff, stimuli, but the ego organizes it, filters it, prioritizes it. And the default mode network, it's involved with some of that. It's got that kind of organizational feature, right? It's very suppressive of other things. So there's some correlation there. I wouldn't say the default mode network is the ego. I don't think that's terribly accurate because it's more complicated than that, and the ego is kind of a bigger thing. There's also the superego, which is sort of the rules of life, the kind of the bigger morality, ethical concerns, and so that's definitely other parts of the mind too. And but yeah, that's also where that law of entropy kind of applies. The id is a very chaotic, high entropy part of our mind. The ego, very orderly, you know, taking the chaos, making sense of it, organizing it. Psychedelics play a big role in sort of increasing the entropy, right? So that's probably why people talk about the ego dissolving under psychedelics, because you just don't have as much of those kind of default mode network processes or superego or ego stuff going on, which then, I mean, you know, sometimes psychedelic states look a little bit more animalistic, right? People are less concerned with kind of being an upstanding citizen and, you know, just kind of reverting back to, just being a crazy human. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot to say about that. That's cool, yeah.
On that autism idea you were talking about, I read a book by John Elder Robeson, Switched On, and he did some experiments where they put a magnet on his brain, and then he was able to feel emotions, whereas all his life before that he couldn't tell what another book he wrote was Look at Me, you know, because he couldn't look at other people, you know. Autistic people are, you know, but he didn't talk about psychedelics, but it seems like it's the same type of deal where it's switching these neurons on in the brain.
And maybe activating something that wasn't active, and Yeah, potentially. Yeah, I mean that's kind of what seems to be happening. Things are active that are not normally active under psychedelics. So potentially, yeah, someone lacking empathy or ability to relate to people in some ways.
But he's on YouTube, John Elder Robeson.
Okay.
You could see him back then, and then now he's a lot improved after he's done these, experiments.
The magnet stuff.
It's a TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Okay.
We're using it a lot for mental health.
TMS, yeah.
Cool. And that does a similar thing as psychedelics and neurogenesis and stuff?
Well, it's just like putting a magnet over a part of the brain and trying to like either turn it off or on.
Okay.
Depending on whether it's an active or
Cool.
inactive.
Yeah.
There's two different modes. There's an excitatory mode with TMS, where you can like make muscles fire and you can make things more excitable. And there's an inhibitory mode that makes the neurons less. It's like applying Valium very locally.
Oh, wow. Is it depending on like the polarity of the magnet, or how do they?
It's like repetition rate.
Repetition. So there's that oscillating charge.
So like different frequencies.
Yeah. There's a certain frequency that will cause the neurons to basically stop functioning.
Interesting.
People apply right along the midline to try to get the default mode network synced in, and people have reported being unable to do things that would require the default mode network.
Are there side effects to this therapy?
There may be.
Transient, maybe?
I remember, so we had a bunch of friends that did a lot of TMS, and I remember that there was this one study showing the long-term effect, and it freaked everybody out. They're like, no, we can't do it.
Long-term side effects?
It was just one paper, but.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wonder why it's not more popular.
I mean, it is. It's just, I mean, our department uses it a lot. They have a TMS clinic at the VA.
Is it expensive, or?
It is.
Okay.
But I think I think maybe insurance covers it. They give it to veterans, basically. It's covered, I think, at the VA.
Okay.
I would don't buy insurance covers it. Yeah, it does. They're using it for like PTSD and depression.
Okay. So there's some effectiveness. All right. Cool. Well, hopefully, some room for psychedelics to improve on that, maybe.
It's just not very precise.
Oh, the
You
precision.
can only, stimulate so far if it's something where you got to get subcortical. Or
Oh, I see. Yeah, because you can only get so invasive with that, I suppose.
Otherwise, you do deep brain stimulation.
Yeah.
Where you have to go in and put an electrode in, and that's good for things like Parkinson's and
Right.
for OCD.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's the invasiveness. That's an issue, right? And if psychedelics can act on natural, BDNF pathways, that's very far on the non-invasive spectrum. And
Some disorders, like Parkinson's, they just don't have that. Drugs don't work. They need a stimulator.
Okay.
It's the only thing that works.
But if that whole lion's mane psilocybin thing is a thing, then maybe.
Yeah, but if you have a damaged circuit and it's just missing something, like you can't
But-
store it. You can't restore it necessarily.
Oh, if it's beyond repair.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll hope.
How much loss there is.
Yeah.
You can amplify something if there's atrophy or decreased activity, but if there's actual cell death, you can't really replace it.
So lion's mane isn't able to revive a dead cell?
It could promote neurogenesis, but there's only so much neurogenesis in the brain, and it's only in specific regions. So if your loss of a certain part of your brain is in an area where neurogenesis is going to get at that, aside from putting stem cells in there.
Right. Cool. Awesome discussions tonight. It's 9 o'clock. Y'all can leave if you want.
Well, we only have the room till 9.
Okay.
This is a tangent, kind of tangential.
Yeah.
Like in your research, come across anything about psychedelics and cancer, maybe improvement in cancer?
Cancer. I have not seen.
Communication problems, say cancer. I mean, there's been cases where people had out of body, they died from cancer and had an out of body experience.
Yeah.
And in the body recovered.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty controversial stuff there, but I think it's worth looking at. I mean, this is kind of speaking about the sort of the psychosomatic or maybe even beyond that, emotional, spiritual parts of a self affecting.
The fact that your body is not communicating with itself very well.
Yeah.
So it starts to kill itself.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth looking at. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about cancer, you know, and these anecdotal reports, these case studies, like, yeah, they're case studies, but yeah, like how many times have you heard, you know, cancer doctors not being able to explain why a tumor went away? And so, yeah, I think that's, I mean, psychedelics, if they're changing basic perception, then certainly something there, yeah.